Thank you for joining us today for our Live Well webinar about intimacy and Parkinson's. My name is Devon Fulford. I am the Director of Content and Education at the Phinney Foundation. I have two amazing guests with me today to talk about what's really kind of a difficult subject, but it's something that's really important and needs to be discussed. I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to introduce herself first.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. So my name is Lisa Thomas, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a certified clinical sex therapist based in Denver, Colorado. I've been in private practice as a therapist specializing in treating individuals and couples with a focus on clinical sex therapy for 23 years.
I'm Daniel Fleshner. I'm a licensed professional counselor and certified sex therapist, also located in Denver, Colorado. Similar to Lisa, I work with individuals as well as couples, and I specialize in relationship challenges, especially around communication. I'm just really excited to be here and to be able to share some of what I feel with you. I had a grandfather with whom I was very close, and he had Parkinson's as well. And so I have that personal connection there, and I'm just really excited to be able to try to contribute in any little way that might be helpful.
Thank you, Daniel and Lisa. Thank you so much for being here. We're thrilled to have you. So let's delve in. Why don't we just start by talking about kind of what a healthy sex life can look like?
Sure. So that's a question that comes up all the time. And I think the answer is really important to take within the context of each individual person and each individual relationship. So fundamentally, that's just based on what meets your individual needs. And if you are in a relationship, then the needs of your partner as well. To that point, I think it's important to be pleasure-based rather than performance-based. And so what I mean by that is thinking, okay, what actually feels good for me and my partner? What is going to make this experience connecting and fulfilling, as opposed to trying to meet some metric or some idealistic view of what sex is like. And so I think we want to get out of the idea of sex is supposed to happen X number of times or for a certain duration, or we need to make sure everybody is orgasming or having a specific reaction to this. At the end of the day, if you and your partner are both happy with what your sex life looks like, that's what matters. Mm-hmm. And so let's talk about how we get there. The first way that we're going to make sure you get there is communication. And I mean that both during the sexual encounter as well as when you're not actively having sex. So when you're in the bedroom and you're saying, hey, I really want you to do XYZ thing, or, maybe we should take a step back on that. Or even something like, what I've always wanted to try. Would you be interested in something along those lines? And then translating that outside the bedroom as well. So taking opportunities to check in and say, I really like XYZ about our sex life, or I wish it could change in this way, and negotiating what those boundaries might be and how we can best meet one another's needs in a way that feels really comfortable and safe to all parties. Mm-hmm. Another big aspect of this, when we go back to what a healthy sex life looks like, is physical and sexual health. And that can be from an aging standpoint. It can be from an illness standpoint. It can just be from, have I been exercising a lot recently? Or have I been taking medications that have been influencing what I'm able to do right now? And so you want to incorporate that into that conversation so that we can figure out, okay, just considering where we are in life right now and where we are in our relationship, how can we really make this a great experience for all of us? Mm-hmm. I think another important part of that when we talk about a healthy sex life is the relationship outside of that and non-sexual intimacy. The emotional connection with your partner is so important in being able to also have that strong sexual connection. And so looking at this in a holistic sense and showing your partner that you care about them in general is just so important. And so I want to wrap up this point a little bit by talking about how we do that. And one little suggestion I'd have is by doing what I call rituals of connection. And so those are just things that you can incorporate into your daily life that generally connect you with your partner. It can be making sure that you have dinner together several nights a week, despite how crazy work is, or the roaring social life that you have, or all these other obligations that we want to do in this crazy world of ours. It can be taking 15 minutes to drink your coffee together in the morning instead of pouring it in the travel mug and immediately trying to go into what you're doing. Or it can be having a shared activity that gets you out of constantly talking about doctor's visits or logistics or what the kids are doing. And so what works for me isn't going to be the same as what works for you, but you want to think about what really drew you and your partner together and how you make sure to recapture a lot of that energy.
So considering how many different configurations of relationships there are, can we talk a little bit more about relationship dynamics, maybe what that can look like and how to navigate specific things based on different relationships?
Yeah, so I'll speak to relationships and Parkinson's. So generally, couples, and I talk to couples about this every day in my practice, generally couples follow a script of kind of the way that they're sexual, right? Like somebody initiates, first there's kissing, then there's foreplay, then there's moving into intercourse, then there's afterplay. And what I talk to people about is just learning to be flexible to doing what works and what feels good and expanding your definition of intimacy and being sexual. And really, I found throughout my practice and throughout my life, when couples sort of adopt or when individuals adopt this being flexible when it comes to sex, it works a whole lot better and it's a lot more satisfying. So the next big point is to have patience. So keep in mind that for the general population, about 20% of all sexual attempts are going to be failures. And failures are kind of defined as a sexual act that doesn't result in orgasm or intercourse. So again, being flexible and focusing on what feels good and what you're comfortable with is key. Especially with medications, because medications, can contribute to different reactions. So the next point is to talk about physical limitations and changes that you're experiencing openly and honestly. So my big piece of advice is to go to the doctor together, go to medical appointments together. This way you can better navigate and understand your options, especially around your medications and how they might affect your sexual drive or your sexual functioning. You can also speak to your treatment provider to see if using a different medication could help you with sexual functioning. So, for example, using a different antidepressant that may not hinder sexual functioning. Antidepressants are really known for orgasmic dysfunction, like trouble with being able to achieve having an orgasm. So sometimes, switching antidepressant medication can help with that. That's just a small example. But also asking, like, for example, if you're struggling with erectile issues, asking about adding in Viagra or Cialis, or perhaps a combination of those two things could be helpful. Hormone replacement therapy could be helpful. Using lubrication when you're sexual could be helpful. So again, like talking about physical changes openly and honestly, and incorporating your doctor, incorporating your healthcare team. Next point is looking for alternate ways to maintain physical and emotional closeness. So Daniel sort of spoke about this, rituals of connection and, spending time together in a meaningful way. So having affectionate touching, hand-holding, kissing, cuddling. Not all intimacy needs to be sexual intimacy in order for it to be positive and meaningful.
Thanks, Lisa. You said so much. And I mean, gosh, that was just packed full of advice for various ways to connect and communicate. And it's hard. It's really hard. And when you have a Parkinson's diagnosis, absolutely everything changes, and maybe not all at once, but it changes. And sexuality and intimacy changes over the course of our lifetimes as well. So what does that really look like? What does that mean? And how do we navigate changes in our lifetime with our sexuality and intimacy?
In terms of sex over the course of the lifespan and as aging happens, the conversations that I was talking about earlier, the conversations that Lisa was talking about are dynamic. these aren't things that you just have once in your life and that you then think like, okay, great, we both are on the same page. We're gonna be good to go. What works for you when you're 20 isn't going to be the same as what works for you from when you're 40 or when you're 60 or when you're 80 or at any of those points. And so you want to be willing to revisit these conversations and check in and say, hey, I've noticed that our sex life is still great, in my opinion. Is that what's coming up for you as well? Or, hey, I'd like to revisit this. There are some things that used to work for me that aren't quite working anymore. I was hoping we could talk about this. And so I want that to just be seen as this evolving conversation throughout the entirety of your relationship. So, with that said, let's talk about some of the more prominent physiological changes that happen. For men, oftentimes there's difficulty maintaining erections as they get older. There's often delayed orgasm or difficulty orgasming in general. For women, there can be issues with less lubrication, as well as, again, issues with regards to orgasming, and a lot of these can be prominent both in perimenopause and during menopause. I want to also name that this isn't necessarily something that's completely prescriptive. This can differ on an individual basis. And so you want to be checking in with yourself about what's changing in your body so you can communicate that to your partner. With all of that said, these are not things that need to be some massive issue in your sex life. These are just things that I want you and your partner or your partners to potentially manage over the course of the relationship. So for something like difficulty getting or maintaining an erection, that's something that can often be handled with either sex therapy or with medication, specifically erectile dysfunction pills such as Cialis or Viagra. I believe my knowledge is that these should not interact negatively with medications that are commonly prescribed for Parkinson's, but please do, of course, check with your medical provider about that before using anything. But as Lisa was saying, you can go with your partner to your doctor and say, hey, this is what's going on. How can we get some medication or some sort of referral in order to help manage this issue? There are also things you can do in your relationship. So if we're talking about issues with lubrications or erectile dysfunction, you can go to a sex shop. You can find lubrications there. You can find different sorts of toys or even kind of engaging sex games that you can play with your partner. So this doesn't have to be this highly clinical, we need to get the perfect medication. We need to solve this problem directly. We can figure out what's actually fun, and you can go and you can, have a kind of spicy experience with your partner there that really gets the two of you going and gets you on the path to trying out some more things that could really enhance your sex life. I also want to really encourage couples, and honestly, this is wherever you are, in terms of your physiological changes, to take the focus off of the orgasm. I get it. They're great. We all love them. But there's so much more to sex than that. There's so much that can be really fulfilling, and it can lead to so much anxiety and so much pressure if we're just treating sex as, well, we're going to do whatever we can to get to an orgasm. And then when we do, our sex is done and we're good to go and we've succeeded. I would really encourage you to just think, okay, what can really make this pleasurable? What can feel connecting here? What are we both really desiring right now? And if an orgasm happens, then great, but that's not going to be the determinant in whether it was a really enjoyable experience for you and your partner. Additionally, I want to encourage you to think back on what I was talking about earlier with those rituals of connection and non-sexual touch, because especially as aging happens and as medications get introduced, it isn't necessarily this one-to-one connection of, okay, we're getting ready to have sex and I'm just good to go right away. Having some sort of teasing or foreplay throughout the day or just general feeling of closeness can really help you get into the mood, can help alleviate some of these problems that we were talking about, and can also help the two of you have conversations about whether you're ready to have sex in a non-shaming way. And lastly, I want to just touch on libidos change throughout your life. They're going to wax and wane in any relationship, and that's going to go for all partners involved. And so just make sure that you're able to talk about that in an understanding way so that we understand what's happening. Because a lot of time people think, oh my God, my partner is not as interested sexually in me as they used to be. And it must mean I've done something wrong, or it must mean that, they're going to leave me or they're unhappy with something. That's often not the case. So just talk to them rather than trying to get all in your own head and try to read the tea leaves about what's going on.
Absolutely. I'm seeing some questions, and just generally speaking, it can be really difficult to always be thinking about your intimacy as a couple. So a lot of times it's one person who's always initiating sexual activities or intimacy, or it's the other person who you're individuals and a couple all at the same time. And those things all need to be kept in mind. So what are some ways to just address natural dynamics that arise?
Focus on strengths. So Parkinson's may bring limitations, but it doesn't define your entire identity or your identity as a couple. You want to acknowledge your strengths, talents, and accomplishments and celebrate them. You want to stay connected. You want to engage with supportive friends, family, and community. You want to surround yourself with positive influences that can boost your morale and remind you that you're not alone in your journey. You want to set realistic goals, so breaking tasks into manageable steps and setting achievable goals for yourself. You want to celebrate victories as they contribute to your sense of accomplishment. You also really want to practice self-compassion. So be gentle with yourself on difficult days, connect with one another, talk about your feelings, allow yourself to rest when needed, and don't be too hard on yourself for things that are beyond your control.
So we're going to shift gears just a tiny bit. So everything that you both have been sharing so far has been really positive, really useful, I think, for all sorts of people experiencing issues with intimacy and sexuality. One of the things that can happen in a lifespan, and one of the things that often happens in a relationship where a person has Parkinson's and a person is a care partner, is, for various reasons, sexual attraction declines or disappears. And this is not by the fault of anyone, but it happens, and this is a reality. Can you speak at all to how to navigate this if this happens in a relationship?
Yeah, and I actually wanted to highlight something you had just said because it was what I wanted to start with as well, which is that if and when this happens, it's nobody's fault. And so I'll get into the relationship dynamics in just a second, but I want to start by saying when you're just looking internally, don't shame yourself if you lose attraction to your partner. You don't need to put those judgments on yourself. It's not like you asked this to happen. And it's just something that we're trying to manage. And so I think it's okay to frame that as like, okay, this is something that's happening and we need to deal with it, but it's not malicious. It's not something that I've set out to do. With that said, I think that it's really important to be willing to figure out what conversations around this look like, because it can often be an elephant in the room that one partner is losing attraction, often the caretaker. And so we can either get it out in the open and at least try to process the feelings around it and figure out what we're going to do, or we can just have this sort of awkward push and pull where we both sort of know what's going on, but nobody's willing to say it. And so if it were me, I'd much rather get this out into the open and have some of these difficult conversations. Once that happens, I think it's really important to figure out, are we equipped to have this conversation on our own, or do we need to bring in somebody else, such as a couples therapist? It's possible that you and your partner are so good at communicating that you are able to do this on your own. You're able to take some of the points that Lisa was talking about earlier, some of those conversation starters, and make it work. But this is also a great time to go and try to find a sex or relationship therapist to talk through some of these things. People think so much about couples therapy in the context of, okay, we go there if everything's a disaster and we're trying desperately to salvage it, but you can do it just to solve a more discrete issue like this, even if things are generally positive. Once you're having those conversations, I think it's important to talk specifically about what your boundaries are and where you're trying to go and what you're trying to accomplish with this. So is it a situation where you're trying to figure out, okay, how can we have some of those gradual sensate type processes and get back to a point where we can be sexual with one another? Or is this a situation where I'm not feeling comfortable with that right now for one reason or another, and I want to take this off the table? And once you do that, it can guide you to figuring out either, okay, we can try for some sensate focus. We can, there are tons of resources on this that we can figure out, or we're going to renegotiate what boundaries are so we can try to figure out how to get sexual needs met. That can include, I would still like to have some physical contact with you. I'd like to cuddle. I'd like to have massages, but I'm not really in a place where I am ready to have sex. It could be, I really don't feel like I'm even ready to do some of those more intimate things, but perhaps we can renegotiate boundaries around pornography or erotica or something like that. And so a lot of times we just want to make sure that we can talk about what our needs are, talk about what our options are in terms of getting them met, and then be honest in a compassionate way about what's actually coming up for us. Because what I want, um, couples where this is happening to avoid is a situation where one partner is trying to initiate sex. The other partner, the one who's less attracted, is saying, I'm not interested in that right now. They perhaps make some sort of excuse about why they don't want to have it. And this repeats a lot, leading the first partner to feel confused, to feel rejected, etc. And so figuring out what are our options to potentially get our sexual needs met that don't necessarily involve the two of us being sexually intimate, if that is where our relationship is right now. The last thing I want to say about this is thinking about how we show love for one another and figuring out what our love languages are. Some of you may be familiar with love languages. Some people might not be as familiar with love languages, but sex is one way we can really show our love and care for our partner, but it's not the only way. Often we try to give love in the way that we'd want to receive love, and it's a really compassionate thing to do, but that doesn't mean it's how your partner wants to receive love. If, for example, I would really want my partner to say something really nice to me or would want them to give me a gift that shows they care, that's great, but it's also possible that that's not what my partner would want. Perhaps they would be interested in spending a lot of time together or developing some rituals to show that we care about one another or in having more sexual intimacy or something like that. And so again, having these conversations around how we can really show that we care and how we can develop that strong emotional connection and to maintain that even if we're not fully on the same page about our level of attraction, I think is so important. And so I understand this can be a really emotionally charged and difficult topic to consider, but I have confidence that, each of you has the resiliency and has the ability to hang in there and have the conversation because you care about your partner and because you want to make things work.
That's tough.
Yeah.
I think that's really important advice, Daniel. It's a really tough topic. One of the big questions that we get so much from the audience that we've had prior to this webinar, that we regularly get through the blog email box and that I've seen in the webinar chat today, is about medications. A big part of a lot of people with Parkinson's experience is medications. And there are many considerations having to do with medications and sex. So, Lisa, would you be willing to delve into that a little more?
If you're having medication side effects, you want to make sure that you're speaking to your healthcare team about it. Also, you could look to talk to a certified sex therapist like Daniel or to myself if you specifically want to get into your unique and specific situation. A great place to look for a certified sex therapist is on the website asec.org, and ASEC stands for the American Academy of Sexual Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. And perhaps we can put that in the chat, or we can make sure that folks have access to that website to look for a certified sex therapist in your state, in your country, on your continent. Okay, so regarding medications and the timing of intimacy, finding the best time for sexual activity when taking Parkinson's medications can vary depending on your individual responses and your medication schedule. For many Parkinson's medications, there's a period after taking them when their effects are at their peak, so like peak medication time. This window of time can be ideal for engaging in sexual activity, as you may experience better control over your motor symptoms and fewer medication-related side effects that could interfere with intimacy at a later time. So kind of paying attention to, after you take your medication, what the effects are and if they are positive or negative on sexual functioning. And I'm going to normalize for a lot of couples, even busy couples that are managing a chronic illness, scheduling intimacy or talking about timing. those couples at the end of a week, at the end of the month, at the end of the year, they have more intimacy because it's kind of discussed where it goes in the schedule. So there's less of like one partner initiating and the other partner kind of being like, this isn't a good time for me, or I didn't know this was happening. So it's good to communicate like when the ideal time may be, and it may be around medication. Another point I wanted to talk about is that sometimes medications can contribute to having sexual compulsivity. This has kind of been a topic that's been brought up. I wanted to talk about it just for a moment. Really, the best way to manage sexual compulsivity is by talking about these feelings and impulses together and coming up with a management strategy. For example, if one partner has very high desire as a side effect of their medication, perhaps the individual can lean on their partner for some of the intimacy, but perhaps it can't be the total solution. So you may have to talk about or consider masturbation as an outlet and normalizing this idea. The couple may also want to discuss if pornography use is acceptable as a part of the masturbatory equation. So sometimes partners have feelings about how the masturbation is happening. And so this should be discussed. Arguments or hurt feelings about pornography use can be avoided by talking about this directly. Talking about boundaries in your relationship can also be helpful, like what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. So talking about boundaries in the relationship and how to kind of manage this compulsivity.
Somebody asked if sex can actually be beneficial for Parkinson's symptoms.
I think that sex has a lot of benefits generally, and those also apply to people that are living with Parkinson's. And so that can be increased connection with others. It can be stress reduction. It can be tension release. And so there's probably a medical doctor out there who can speak exactly to some of the physical or motor symptoms that occur, but the benefits that sex has also are inclusive of when one of the people having sex is a person with Parkinson's.
And I'll chime in to say that, there's no age limit on sex and intimacy. People are intimate and sexual throughout their lifespan. People, I have couples that see me that are in their 80s, which is amazing. So there's no age limit and no condition that puts a cap on having desire, wanting closeness, wanting that connection with another human being or with your partner.
Absolutely. So actually, just earlier today in the chat, Judith asked a question that kind of relates to what you're just saying here, Lisa. Working with people who've been partnered for a very long time, when they first got together, it was very common or almost always the case that the men were expected to be the advancer, make the sexual pass, make the connection, and that the women took more of a passive role for the most part. And so what would you suggest for helping couples change that dynamic if he's the person with Parkinson's and not as apt to initiate sex or intimacy?
Yeah, so I would have that couple really focus on communicating about how there needs to be, or maybe at this point in our relationship, we want to have symmetry with kind of initiating and different ways of initiating. Maybe a way to initiate is to talk about like, hey, maybe could we plan on trying to have some intimacy tomorrow afternoon? So yeah, sometimes couples, again, it's getting stuck in the script of kind of the way it used to be or kind of how our relationship started with gender roles. Maybe the man was the one to initiate intimacy 100% of the time. And now, we want to kind of have the woman or the other partner kind of be the one responsible for initiating some of the time. So I would have the couple talk openly about it and talk about ways that maybe initiating could have more symmetry, or how to help the other person, like how to help her feel comfortable with initiating, like what's comfortable for her, right? Maybe it's not doing something physical, like maybe it's not just like starting to kiss him. Maybe it's saying, hey, can we go back to bed in the morning? We get up, we brush teeth, we take medicine, and then maybe we go back to bed. So a new ritual of connection. But really, to answer your question, like having the couple talk about it and having the couple lean into this idea of like flexibility, like what works for us now. And, and this is really how couples continue to have a sexual relationship over their lifespan, right? Like it's not always going to look the way it did when we were in our 20s or early in our relationship. Like it has to evolve, like the rest of our life is evolving.
Yeah, and I know we're trying to get through a few more questions, so I'm just going to touch on this real quick. But I think a lot of this is also individual work by the care partner and figuring out how to help that person maintain their identity. A lot of the time, and again, it's personal, but a lot of the time when someone is concerned about initiating, it can come back to internalized messages that they've gotten. It can perhaps touch on things like traditional gender roles. And so it's not to say it's all the case, but helping that person maintain their identity outside of just being a care partner or something like that, and ensuring that to the extent possible, they are able to go out and like continue doing a lot of things they enjoy, so that being the care partner doesn't become all encompassing for them, I think could help increase that sense of confidence, their own libido, and all of that is going to make it more likely that they'll be willing to initiate something.
Yeah, definitely. And so while we're on the topic of joy, Kristen in the chat asked a wonderful question as well. Can you talk about descaling expectations and introducing more joy into the relationship, which in return may increase intimacy?
Yeah, there's a certain sense of irony that when you're not constantly thinking about sex, or you might actually be more likely to increase intimacy or to have it. But I was touching on this a bit earlier, but you got together for a reason. There's so many things you like about one another. And so how do we remember what those are and how we connect on those things? If you used to be able to stay up having these really intellectually stimulating conversations, like, are you still doing that? Or are you each just kind of scrolling on your phones or just thinking about logistics all day, right? Like it's so specific. Like what works for me or for you, it is going to be different than what works for someone else. But like really reflect on what is great about the relationship and like let's do that and let's figure out how to incorporate it to the extent possible.
I think we have time for one more question. So another question we got was, if a person is diagnosed with Parkinson's after not having intimacy for a really long time, what are some strategies for starting that again?
Good question. So I would go back to this idea of gradually, right? Like communicating about the idea of starting to have some kind of an intimate relationship again. Start gradually with affectionate touching, maybe laying together, then moving into the emotional component of like being close, right? And then finally the sensate component of like massage, this idea of kind of, using all of your senses together to kind of like relax and connect, and then finally moving into some sexual touching. So really starting with affectionate touching and then having it move into more sexual touching. So starting with massage and then kind of like having the massage become more sensual or sexual, right? With like moving the massage into manual stimulation, oral stimulation, like really, trying to arouse each other. And then finally moving into having intercourse if that's comfortable and consensual with both parties.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Daniel. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think I basically just want to mirror all of that. But what I wanted to mention as well is just whether we're talking about joy or whether we're talking about these sensual exercises that Lisa's referencing, to try to be present with them and to do those things because of the value that they have and the connection that they can bring, as opposed to thinking I'm doing this because then we're going to start having more sex. Like ideally that will be part of the holistic relationship as well. but these things have so much value, and you want to be able to like really be present and enjoy the experiences as they come up.
Staying in the moment versus what's in that end goal, what's way out there in the future. That, I mean, I think for everything in life, that's a wonderful challenge to give ourselves, to stay more present and focused in the moment. Lisa and Daniel, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your expertise.